This is Lake Tiberias, also known as the Sea of Galilee, also known as Lake Kinneret, the main freshwater lake of Israel. The lake's water level began dropping, and dropping rapidly. And that's when Israel decided to do something no one had dared to do before: pump water up a mountain, defying logic, defying gravity. Dozens of miles away from Kinneret, they built massive pipes, installed powerful pumps, and spent hundreds of millions of dollars on the whole thing. Here's the idea. We pull in salty water straight from the Mediterranean Sea and pump it into a freshwater lake. Yes, it sounds like someone's crazy idea. Why on earth would you salt a freshwater lake? But in reality, there's a logic to it, especially in a country where every single drop of water is precious. So let's break it down. Defying gravity. An unobtrusive reminder to do that thing under the video. As I've already said, the lake has many names, and the Sea of Galilee is among the most confusing of them because it's easy to assume the water here is salty. Though actually the Kinneret is fresh. Its size is quite substantial. The circumference is about 33 miles, the length is roughly 13 miles, and the width is around 8 miles. The lake is fed partly by underground springs, but mostly by the Jordan River, which brings in the majority of its water. If it weren't for this lake, Israel might not have taken the shape it has today. Lake Kinneret drew people in like a magnet. Favorable climate, flat terrain, fertile soil, and an abundance of water, by local standards, made this region perfect for life. The rivers flowing into the lake and the nearby plains provided food and work for locals throughout history. That's why settlements and villages kept growing around the lake. Trade thrived, and boats carried people and goods across the water. The place was famous for its fish, and fishing had always been one of the main occupations of the locals. In short, life was bustling. And then the 20th century arrived, and everything changed overnight. Between the 1950s and the 1970s, Israel's population grew from 1.4 million to 2.5 million people. Newcomers were arriving in the region, children were being born, and the country was expanding right before everyone's eyes. At the same time, the population pushed farther south into dry, hot areas where water was scarce. And when the water shortage there became impossible to ignore, the solution seemed obvious. Simply reroute water from the north to the south. In the 1950s, Israel developed a plan to link the Kinneret to the rest of the country's water infrastructure through the national water carrier, so that everyone would have access to water. It was the biggest, most ambitious, and most expensive construction project in the country's history. Israel made water flow through pipes across the entire nation. Picture an artificial river of colossal scale laid out amid heat and desert. Back then, Israel was still a poor country, and the construction of the national water carrier became a massive undertaking that engaged people all over the country. At the peak of the work, 1 out of every 14 able-bodied residents was digging trenches, welding pipes, pouring concrete, and assembling this giant system. The project consumed roughly 5% of the entire national GDP, an enormous figure even by today's standards, and demanded new engineering solutions invented right on the fly. Millions of cubic feet of rock were dug out and hauled away, cliffs were cut through, and concrete flowed like rivers. In the end, the water carrier stretched for about 80 miles. Every hour, it can move up to 19 million gallons of water. That amounts to roughly 449 million gallons each day. Sounds as if someone decided to pump an entire lake through the country. The system isn't just pipes. There are open canals, tunnels, reservoirs, and massive pumping stations. The water first enters the intake, a pipe several hundred feet long laid directly underwater in the northern part of the Kinneret. Then it goes into a reservoir on the shore, and from there to a pumping station that pushes it farther along. Next comes the Jordan Canal, an open channel that runs for 10 miles along a mountain slope. When it's full, the water in it's about 9 feet deep, and it moves solely under the force of gravity. No magic, just physics. Through reservoirs, holding basins, treatment stations, and enclosed pipelines, the water keeps going farther south, almost to the very border with Egypt. At the end of its journey, the water reaches the Negev, a harsh, rocky desert, mountains, dust, sparse vegetation, and dry riverbeds they call wadis. And yet, people live here. About 630,000 people live in a region that covers 55% of the country's total territory. That's roughly 8.2% of the population. And thanks to the national water carrier, this is not mere survival, but a normal human life. The construction of the national water carrier truly transformed Israel. It opened up the possibility of building towns in places where water had once been just a dream, and where the geography stood in the way. Now people could not only live in such areas, but actually thrive there. New immigrants received land and took up farming, and the country built its agricultural economy almost from scratch. Food exports began, bringing in billions of dollars. Greenery emerged where there had previously only been stone and sand. True greenery. The launch of the system became an almost mythical moment. For the first time, Israel felt it could bend nature to its will, that it could create its own artery feeding the country with water. The Kinneret turned from a lake into the heart of the state, from where life-giving force flowed through pipes for hundreds of miles. After the system was launched, 80% of the lake's water went to agricultural needs and only 20% to drinking water. But the country grew. People needed more and more clean water, and by the early 1990s, the national water carrier was already providing half of all drinking water in Israel. From 1970 to 2018, the lake's water level mostly stayed within a safe range. For almost that entire period, the Kinneret hardly ever dropped below the special mark of 700 feet above sea level. And even more until the early 2000s, the water level was often higher than the minimum acceptable value. It seemed like everything was under control. But then the trouble began. In the years when rainfall was critically low, the level sank below that very mark. This happened in 2000 to 2002, then again in 2008 to 2011, and once more in 2016 to 2018. As a result, water for agriculture had to be restricted, because nobody needs an empty lake. In winter, when the lake is usually supposed to fill up with rain, the water barely rose. And in summer, when the pumps worked at full capacity, the Kinneret was shrinking before everyone's eyes. The water level could drop by 0.4 inches per day. And this was happening every single day. This photo was taken in 2018, and it clearly shows how much the lake level fell compared to 2010. Israel now gets, on average, 30% less rainfall than it used to. In 2018, the drought left the country short of 660 billion gallons of water compared to normal years. That's about 1 million Olympic pools. 1 million! Imagine a giant pile of pools. And all of that just vanished from nature. And in this photo, a sign in Tiberias shows the level of the Sea of Galilee, 685 feet below sea level. The date is May 9th, 2020. The lower red line is at 699 feet. Pumping water below this mark threatens to damage the entire surrounding ecosystem. And below the black line, which is at minus 705 feet, irreversible destruction begins, and pumping water becomes completely impossible. When the lake's level began to fall, a whole new set of problems followed. Israel had already started actively using desalinated water from the Mediterranean and drawing less from the Kinneret, but the destructive processes in the lake had already begun. If the lake doesn't have proper water exchange, when old water flows out, new water flows in, salt starts to accumulate. The water slowly but steadily becomes more saline. But the main problem is that increased salinity speeds up the growth of cyanobacteria, the microscopic algae on the surface of the reservoir. They can severely worsen drinking water quality and make it unusable even for farmers. Water that's too salty is simply deadly for many crops. You pump it, you irrigate it, and yet the plants still die. Even worse, as the water level dropped, patches of the lake bed began to surface. They turned into tiny islets that look as if the lake is simply retreating, surrendering ground to the land. And that is a very alarming sign. Even if Israel stopped pumping water from the lake entirely, it might still take a miracle. Several winters in a row with good rains, only that could bring the lake back to a normal level. But miracles are rare in this climate, and so a strange situation emerged. The level wasn't rising, limits on water use were in effect, and Israel was losing huge amounts of precious fresh water. Water that could have gone to homes and fields. But there simply were no other sources back then. Israel kept drawing water from the Kinneret, watching the lake weaken with every season, yet at some point the pumping was reduced. But even that didn't help. During new droughts, the lake would quickly shrink again. The problem wasn't just that Israel took a lot of water. The Kinneret's main source, the Jordan River, was bringing less water. Its headwaters in the Golan Heights were drying up earlier each year. The rainy season was getting shorter, and the water simply stopped reaching the lake in the needed amounts. Plus, in the north, in Lebanon and Syria, dams and water intakes were being built, intercepting part of the flow. Everyone took a piece of the Jordan, and so less and less of it reached the Kinneret. As a result, the lake's water level collapsed to its lowest points in decades. Experts were really concerned. Over the last 2 years, it had been dropping by more than 8 feet annually on average. This was much faster than during previous droughts. Israel's main water artery was drying up. Where water once stood, boats were now stranded on the bottom. The roots of trees that were supposed to be underwater suddenly became the new shoreline. Newspapers ran frightening headlines like "Kinneret on the brink" and "The lake is crying for help." This wasn't just a dramatic metaphor. The lake's unstable level was affecting its ecosystem hard. In dry years when almost no new water came in, it literally aged. This worsened the nutrient cycle, affecting algae, bacteria, and the entire lake ecosystem. One scientist said, "Imagine leaving water in a basin for a year. You wouldn't drink it afterward, would you?" It became clear that without urgent action, the country could face a real water crisis. And help came from an unexpected place, the Mediterranean Sea. A huge source of water that had always been right there but barely played any role in saving the Kinneret suddenly began to be seen as the key to survival. So the Mediterranean Sea, endless water before your eyes. It seems like here it is, the perfect solution. Just pour seawater into the lake and the problems are over. But nature has its quirks. Pretty obvious ones, honestly. Seawater is far too salty to enter a lake that supplies the country with drinking water. It's like mixing pure spring water with pickle brine. Yes, it's still water, but you won't want to drink it, and plants won't appreciate it either. That's why Israel decided to play it smarter. Not to fight nature, but to outplay it. The country launched a new national project to preserve the Kinneret as a strategic source of fresh water. And to make it work, they had to change the rules of the game. For the first time in history, the flow of water in the national water carrier didn't go from north to south, but the other way around, from south to north. So the idea is this: desalinated seawater, produced at facilities along the Mediterranean coast, is now sent through a massive network of pipes, pumps, and reservoirs back into the Kinneret, back into the lake. Nature gives us water, and we give water back. Sounds like a fair trade. Construction began in 2018 and full operation started in 2022. The project cost roughly 900 million shekels, about $269 million, and as soon as the driest winter in 100 years hit, the system immediately switched to full power. More precisely, we're talking billions of gallons over the fall-winter season. You can imagine the volume. Desalination technology itself isn't new, of course. The novelty lies in something else. People finally stopped treating nature only as a supplier of water. Now it became a consumer as well. And by the way, this desalinated water is actually better in quality than natural lake water. In terms of salinity and other parameters, it's completely safe for the environment. No nasty surprises. The project was designed from the start with decades in mind. The climate in the Middle East is changing. Rainfall is decreasing, especially in northern Israel. That's why it's so important to keep water levels in the Kinneret high, so it remains a natural treasure and a strategic reserve of fresh water. Israel plans its water sector far ahead. They already have a plan stretching all the way to 2075. Attempts to inject desalinated water into freshwater lakes are extremely rare. The thing is, freshwater ecosystems are very fragile. Even perfectly purified water can alter salinity, acidity, and nutrient balance, and that can affect fish, plants, and the tiny organisms that keep the entire lake in equilibrium. There's also the technical side of the problem. Delivering that much water over long distances is no simple task. You need massive pipelines, pumping stations, and a pressure control system that prevents the lake from overflowing or, on the contrary, drying out. Plus, desalination is expensive, and it once seemed strange to spend such water not on people and farmers, but on a lake. But Israel chose to do something no one else in the world had ever tried. And they didn't even have to build new stations for this engineering marvel. The system was already there. The water travels 60 to 93 miles from the desalination plants in Ashdod, Hadera, and other coastal areas through the same infrastructure the country has built over many years. Israel has long mastered turning salt water into fresh water, and now it simply reversed the flow back to nature. Just 10 years ago, Israel was sounding the alarm. Fresh water was running out. Today, the situation is completely different. Now, about 75% of all drinking water in the country is desalinated from the Mediterranean Sea, meaning that most of the water in your tap started out as seawater. There are 5 major desalination plants operating in Israel. Together, they produce roughly 158 billion gallons a year. These are enormous numbers. Take, for example, the desalination plant in Ashkelon. When it opened in 2005, it was the largest facility of its kind in the world. Right after launch, it produced 26 billion gallons of water per year. And today, it's already at 32 billion gallons. That's about 20% of all the desalinated water in the country. And yes, if you're drinking tap water anywhere in Israel, there's a good chance part of it comes from Ashkelon. The plant looks like a real industrial city. Miles of pipes, massive reservoirs, pumps working 24/7. All of this turns salty seawater into high-quality drinking water, which is then sent through pipelines to towns, villages, and fields. Thanks to projects like these, Israel is now a water-rich country. It no longer depends on the whims of the weather or worries whether those 20 inches of rain will fall each year. 2 more facilities are already under construction, and capacity is almost unlimited. When someone turns on a tap in their kitchen, what flows out is a mix of desalinated, groundwater, and treated river water. The composition changes constantly, but the important thing is that there's enough water. To deliver this desalinated water to the north for people and to raise the level of Lake Kinneret, the country needs additional pumping stations because the water still has to be pushed all the way to the lake. And Israel became the first country in the world to make seawater climb uphill to save its freshwater lake. Not down the way water usually flows, but up, defying gravity. To make water flow in the opposite direction, they literally had to rebuild the body of the country. Old pipes, pumping stations, filters, everything that had been sending water downhill for decades now had to push it uphill. In 2022, the first phase of this new reverse water conveyor was completed. The entire project is estimated at roughly 1 billion shekels. And just the first part took about 3.5 years of construction. At this stage, they built 18 miles of pipeline from the Eshkol station near the Mavel Junction to Nahal to Salmon. The next section is expected to be finished around 2025 near Kibbutz Ravid. And the final phase, scheduled for 2029, includes the construction of new pumping stations near Rosh Hayan and sending water back into Lake Kinneret through the already existing national pipeline. Once the system is fully operational, the pipes will be able to return up to 32 billion gallons of water to the lake each year, depending on rainfall, demand, and how much desalinated water is in reserve. This is brutal terrain. Rock, elevation changes, heat, wind. But a pipe can't say, oh, this part is difficult. It has to be laid further, and they laid it anyway. On the map, the water line stretches from the coast and farther north, crawling under olive groves, skirting hills where there used to be no roads and no people. In the end, the project can raise the lake's water level by roughly 28 inches each year. The aqueduct is a 5-foot diameter pipe running for 19 miles, a giant iron serpent that protects the country from thirst. The uniqueness of this project is that it gives us almost limitless flexibility, the engineers say. We can take water from where it exists and send it wherever it's needed, to people, to farmers, to industry, anywhere. And when engineers were asked what downsides this water might have, they just shrugged. Nobody has the answer. We'll be the first in the world to put desalinated water into a natural lake. We didn't find anything problematic during the tests, but there will certainly be things we haven't thought about. Yes, Israel did something no one had ever done before, but it would be wrong to say that this system alone saved Lake Kinneret. Israel's a country that arguably handles life with scarce water better than anyone else on the planet, and knows how to save it too, sometimes in ways that seem completely unexpected to everyone else. Israel has learned to reuse its water, almost bringing it back to life after it's been used. Every gallon that gets treated and sent back into the system is water that doesn't need to be taken from the country's main lake. Back in 1985, Israel began sending treated wastewater to farms through the National Water Carrier. This helped dramatically shrink the gap between people's needs and the amount of water available in the first place. The wastewater coming from our sinks, showers, and toilets doesn't depend on the weather. Rains may come or not. People still wash up, do laundry, cook, and use the bathroom. Well, unless something extraordinary happens, of course. And the more people there are, the more water flows back into the system. It's the only water resource that doesn't shrink, but grows along with the population. By 2015, Israel was already treating and recycling 86% of its wastewater for agriculture, first place in the world. For comparison, Spain comes second with 17%, and in the US, this figure doesn't even reach 10%. Today, Israel reuses almost 90% of its wastewater. Almost all of this water goes to irrigating fields. But there are other uses as well. Sure, you wouldn't pour this water into a drinking glass, but it does contain nutrients that plants need. Plus, wastewater stores energy that can be extracted and used for other purposes. That's why scientists keep improving treatment technology so this water can be used for more tasks. A huge share of Israel's wastewater goes through treatment systems. Biological, chemical, and physical processes remove contaminants and make the water safe for reuse. And about 85% of all treated water goes to agriculture. The Shafdan Wastewater Treatment Facility is Israel's main giant. Every day it takes in roughly 124 million gallons of wastewater. That is everything that drains out of our sinks, bathtubs, and toilets. And out of all that, Shafdan turns about 37 billion gallons of water each year into clean, irrigation-ready water. Thanks to this single facility, more than 60% of all agriculture in the Negev Desert gets its water. Every drop here follows a clever path. First, the wastewater arrives at Shafdan, where it's treated by Mekarat, Israel's main water operator. But the water's journey doesn't end there. Using a special method, the treated water is then pumped underground into an aquifer. There it undergoes natural filtration, as if passing through a giant natural filter made of sand and soil. No human effort needed, no machinery required. Nature itself brings the water to perfect quality. And here's the result. Farmers receive water that's suitable for growing any crops, literally anything. It's safe, it's tasty for plants, and it costs far less than regular drinking water. This kind of water can flow onto fields and public green areas without restrictions and without any health risks. In Israel, saving water isn't just, well, let's try to use a bit less from the tap. It's a way of life, a philosophy. Every drop is as precious as gold here. The country sits in the middle of a desert, rain is rare, and rivers are a scarce resource, and the population keeps growing. Basically, water is like a second currency. And here's what's truly impressive. Israel manages to lose almost no water along the way. According to Israel's 2024 water supply report, over the past 20 years, water losses have gradually dropped from 20% to 7%. For context, the global average loss rate is around 30%. In other words, nearly a third of all water worldwide just seeps into the ground through leaky pipes. But in Israel, it's only 7%. The secret's simple: smart water meters. More than 60% of homes already have them. They help detect leaks immediately and fix them quickly. In 2023, these meters recorded about 204,000 leaks, roughly 18.5% of all installed devices, of which there are 1.1 million. Sounds impressive, and it's precisely thanks to these meters that leaks don't turn into hundreds of millions of gallons of lost water. And by 2026, every meter in Israel is expected to be smart. And this measure alone will save about 100 million shekels every year, roughly $26.9 million. Now look at the big picture. Israel uses more than 660 billion gallons of water every year, but nature gives it only 290 billion gallons, which means a massive shortfall. And yet the country doesn't run dry because the missing 370 billion gallons it literally produces itself by desalinating seawater, treating wastewater, and using slightly brackish water wherever possible. Another marvel of Israel is drip irrigation, a technology that makes it possible to grow crops in places where rain shows up only a couple of times a year. Here, water doesn't rush across the fields and streams. It falls in tiny doses, straight to the roots of each plant, precisely, at the right time and in the right place. Drip irrigation became the very breakthrough of the mid-20th century that allowed Israel to build agriculture in conditions where nature basically said, nope, nothing's going to grow here. The system delivers water and nutrients directly into the soil under every bush, with no unnecessary laws. Its main advantage is obvious even without scientists. With this method, water almost doesn't evaporate and doesn't disappear uselessly into the sand. Sometimes the difference maker between watering a plant and wasting water is nothing more than a puddle on the surface. But here, even those losses don't happen. And although the idea of drip watering is as old as farming itself, it was in Israel that the technology took on a modern form. Plastic emitters appeared, tiny devices that regulate every drop. Thanks to them, drip irrigation became so effective that it started spreading all over the world. Israel shares this know-how. Even farmers from the United States come here for advice. For example, from the state of Utah, where it's also dry and hot. When it comes to growing food in the desert, it's best to learn from those who've already made it bloom. You owe me a like. See you later.